Because it's been in the news quite a bit recently, you've probably heard about the basis trade. Maybe you're wondering what it is or whether you should even care about it. I created this video for two reasons. You do in fact want to understand the systemic financial risks created by the basis trade. But the type of risk inherent in the basis trade, the risk-taking behaviors upon which it's based, are not limited to that trade. In reality, they permeate the global financial system. This may seem vague, but you'll understand what I'm alluding to by the end of the video. So let's dive in. Fundamentally, the basis trade is an arbitrage, which in its most basic form is an attempt to lock in a profit by simultaneously buying and selling essentially the same thing, but at different prices. The classic example: imagine gold is selling for $800 an ounce in New York, but $805 an ounce in London. If you bought an ounce of gold in New York and immediately sold an ounce in London, you would, assuming no other factors or expenses, lock in a profit of $5, more or less risk-free, because you're selling the same thing that you purchased almost as fast as you bought it, but for a higher price. Even though that $5 represents a return of less than 1%, if there was no limit to the number of times you could do that trade, given enough volume, eventually those $5 trades would add up to a nice profit. Now, imagine that a lender decides that because it seems like such a safe trade, they'll lend you $700 of the $800 you need for each ounce of gold that you buy. Now you're earning profit of $5 against every 100 you're putting up, which is a 5% return on every trade you do, assuming no borrowing cost, which isn't realistic, but I'm trying to keep the math simple. Now, take the trade I just described, but change a few things. Assume you're not trading gold, but you're trading what's considered the safest security in the world, U.S. Treasury bonds. Also assume the profit you're capturing isn't 5% or 1% or even 1/10 of 1%. It's even smaller. In fact, it's so small that the only way to make the trade financially attractive is to use huge amounts of leverage or borrowed money. The good news is that because U.S. Treasury bonds are considered risk-free, and the trade is an arbitrage where you're simultaneously selling what is essentially the same bond, lenders will let you borrow almost every penny you need. So even if the profit you're not earning, known as the basis, is tiny, it's not insignificant relative to the amount of your own cash you need to put up, because you can borrow so much of the purchase cost. Now, I've actually significantly oversimplified the structure of the trade, so let's get into the weeds just a little bit. In the typical basis trade, a hedge fund, for example, buys U.S. Treasury bonds and then uses them as collateral to borrow cash from their prime broker. So now that hedge fund has both a long position in Treasury bonds, which they've pledged as collateral but still own, and the cash they've borrowed against those bonds. This is called a repo trade. At the same time, the hedge fund sells a futures contract which requires them to essentially deliver, say, in a few months, the bonds they bought and used as collateral in the repo trade. When that contract expires, the fund delivers the Treasury bonds they originally bought and uses the money they received to pay off the repo loan they got from the prime broker. As long as the profit from the trade exceeds what it cost them to borrow from their prime broker, they have a profit. So if you had to summarize the basis trade, it's about using borrowed money to capture gains resulting from the minute price difference between Treasury bonds and Treasury bond futures, specifically contracts obligating you to sell those bonds in the future. Now that you've got those basics, step back and think about what is actually enabling all of this to occur. It's massive leverage. Put another way, without being able to borrow huge amounts of money very cheaply, there would be no point in putting on the trade. It's about using leverage to create a return where, for all practical purposes, none exists. The primary reason hedge funds and other trading firms can do this is because U.S. Treasury bonds are considered riskless collateral. The problem with this is that, and this is something you should really focus on because it applies well beyond the basis trade, with enough leverage, anything can become risky. It's ironic because the issue isn't that U.S. Treasury bonds are high risk. The broader systemic risk the basis trade creates only exists because U.S. Treasuries are considered very low risk. Of course, the more leverage that is being employed, the less of a market disruption it takes to trigger catastrophic losses. The analogy I would use here is imagine a house that should have been built to withstand a Category 5 hurricane, but could in fact be knocked over by a slight breeze. Now, how much leverage is being employed in these trading schemes? No one's really sure, but by some estimates, traders are using up to 500 times leverage. That is why you're all of a sudden reading about the basis trade. There's a fear that with so much leverage being used by so many traders chasing the same trade, it would only take a small amount of market volatility to trigger a rapid unwinding of the trade, a self-reinforcing doom loop of treasury sales as traders rush to avoid escalating losses, which highlights a kind of glaring irony. Generally speaking, when the financial markets start to panic, investors rush to buy U.S. Treasuries. They're a safe haven. But when a basis trade starts to blow up, they have to sell their treasuries to contain their losses, pushing prices down, even when they would prefer to be buying based on the fundamentals. This is more or less what happened during the COVID crash in March of 2020, if you remember that. Which brings us to another related irony. In many ways, this trade exists only because the U.S. government cannot afford a material disruption in the trading of its debt. In other words, speculators are using massive leverage, not only because the repo market structure enables it, but also because if or when the basis trade blows up, it's basically guaranteed that the Fed will step in and save them because it will have no choice but to restore stability to the market because our entire economy relies on the proper functioning of the U.S. sovereign debt market. It's the ultimate example of too big and too important to fail. This phenomenon of profit-seeking traders being bailed out as a byproduct of the Fed stepping in to save the system is what's commonly described as moral hazard. If massively leveraged traders know that the Fed can't allow the U.S. government debt market to collapse, they have little reason or incentive to decrease the amount of risk they're taking. So keep an eye on the basis trade, but keep in mind the broader point because you see it again and again in the markets. With enough leverage, even the safest security can be made extremely risky, and frequently is. You should be noticing a certain circularity here. The less risky a security is considered, the lower the return. But the less risky a security is, the more others are willing to lend against it. This is how and why leverage tends to migrate into areas of the market where investors least expect it. Remember the U.S. housing crisis in 2008? Arguably, the only reason that was able to occur was because U.S. residential mortgages were considered basically risk-free. Everybody paid their mortgage. This leveraging of the near riskless until it's financially lethal is a recurring phenomenon, a form of systemic financial risk that's always lurking in the markets and building until it can't avoid blowing up. So be careful out there. And thanks for watching the video. I look forward to any comments or questions you may have.